So even people who successfully make it through that standard, that methadone or that Suboxone detox, are going to relapse at rates much higher than what we're seeing. And the other thing that happens with ibogaine, though, is that it makes you much more sensitive to the opioid. This is dangerous in some respects, because if you were to go back to using the amount you used before you had the ibogaine treatment, it would be very dangerous. You would be much more likely to overdose. So that can be problematic. But the other thing is, when people do go back to using, and in the studies that I was talking about, the New Zealand and the Mexico studies, they're going back to using much smaller amounts because of what I just was talking about, which is that it heightens the effects post-treatment. But also people are using the opioids much less frequently in general. So they don't just go back to using every day, right? They might use once or twice, and then they might fall back into an everyday pattern of use, or they might not. But it's much less than they were using before. So just from a harm reduction standpoint, it's clear that the treatment is successful for the vast majority of people. If you're looking for absolute, total abstinence from opioids, the success rates are a lot less. But I think it's not the best measure for looking at success. So I can tell you that in the two studies I was talking about, out of 44 people, I think we had 14 people who were completely abstinent at 12 months, which is, compared to the rates that people have ordinarily, that's really good. If you're comparing them to rates of people who were coming off the standard detox, our rates at 3 months and 6 months are much better too. I think we had, I don't want to say the numbers because I'm not sure of the numbers offhand, but in our study, in the Mexico study, at 1 month, there were 10 people out of 20 I was able to reach who hadn't used opioids the past month, which might not sound great. It's actually a third of the total population of 30 in the study. It might not sound great, but there again, it's much higher than the rates you'd get in standard treatment. So what we did to kind of to measure the success of the ibogaine was we used something that's used in addiction treatment studies, and it's called the Addiction Severity Index. It's a lengthy interview where you ask people about their drug use, and you ask them about related things like how their relationships are going, how their work is, or their employment, their health, their legal status. Are they in trouble with the law? Are they worried about getting arrested? Things like that. And so the Addiction Severity Index, you can have a much better score even if you're using opioids, right? Because you're probably not using them as much as you were, so that reduces your score. And the usage isn't as problematic, so that also reduces the score. So you don't have to be completely abstinent to have success in that regard. If you're looking at, is this keeping you from using as much as you were before, and is it causing problems in your life? So that's what we were really showing, is that with the ibogaine treatment, people are using drugs a lot less. They're using the problematic drugs a lot less, that is, and they're experiencing far fewer problems in their life. Their quality of life is much better. In particular, their relationships with people that matter most to them are vastly improved.
We know ibogaine helps with opioid disorder. Have you seen any other purposes or reasons to use ibogaine to help people with other issues?
Yes. So I would say, and this is actually based on a really exhaustive study that was done by my friend and colleague Ken Alper, who's at NYU. He did a study he and a few other colleagues did a study back in 2000. It was published in 2008, called the ibogaine medical subculture. And what they learned was that about half the people going to get ibogaine treatment are going there for some kind of opioid dependence. And about, I think it was around a third or a quarter, were going there primarily for psychospiritual purposes. So they weren't trying to deal with any addictions, either behavioral or drug addictions. And some of them are going for cocaine abuse or alcohol abuse, alcoholism. And so kind of a mixed bag there. But yeah, personally, I've talked with people who've been treated successfully for alcohol dependence, or for one guy in the study, for example, he not only stopped using opioids, but he had a 2-pack a day cigarette smoking habit, and he stopped like that. And you just don't see that, right? I mean, people have a hard time quitting smoking. Almost, it's not as hard as quitting heroin, but it's really difficult. And this guy was smoking 2 packs a day and just stopped, completely stopped, and hadn't used any in the 12 months to the entire follow-up period. So it's obvious that it's good, and it's obvious to me just anecdotally that it's good for other things than for opioid dependence. And people are also using it for strictly psychospiritual purposes. And I imagine, I haven't heard very many experiential reports for that, but I've heard some, and they're including Rick Doblin, who's the head of MAPS, has told his story on a YouTube video, and he found it to be very useful for him. And I've heard other stories like that where people say, "Oh yeah, it showed me that my internal dialogue, and it showed me that I'm critical of myself, and I kind of got some insight into those voices, those critical voices came from," things like that.
And have you had experiences with either ibogaine or iboga?
Yes, although I haven't had ibogaine itself, and I've had pretty low doses of the iboga root bark. Those have been very interesting, though. So I've had, let's see how many times. I would say, there was the first time when I started my interviews for the study, the Mexico study. I had a very small dose, and then years later, I had a period of 4 days where I was using low doses for about 4 days, and periodically I've had low doses of the root bark powder. But it's been very interesting. What the kinds of things that come up for me have been very interesting. So I would like to have a stronger dose, but medically it's not advisable for me right now.
Okay. And you hear, one of the hot topics now is, the conversation of microdosing, and I've even heard of people, microdosing with ayahuasca. Is iboga or ibogaine, is that something that there could be subtle benefits or other benefits with microdosing as well?
Yeah, I'm sure that there could be and would be, and I know that people have used it in such a manner as well, using it in a microdosing manner. So for me personally, it was very useful. The second time I ever had any of the root bark, I was at a conference in Mexico, and I'd had I guess I would call it a museum dose. I don't know where I heard that term first. It might have been Dennis McKenna using that term, museum dose, where you can tell there's something going on, but you're still totally functional, right? And that was interesting. Colors were brighter. I felt like I don't know, this underlying sense of well-being. This was in the daytime, and at the end of the day, I was in the hotel room with a couple of my friends, and I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes, and then suddenly I started having these visions. This is something that when you have ibogaine, that's what you're told to do, is you close your eyes, and sometimes you can only see the visions when you have your eyes closed. And it hadn't even occurred to me until that point to just lie down and close my eyes, and it was dark outside at that point, so there wasn't a lot of ambient light, and it was so startling, though. I was starting to go into this other world, and it was so startling that I opened my eyes, and it went away, and it wouldn't come back. So, but then the next morning, after I'd had a night of sleep, I woke up, and immediately upon waking up, I was having these insights into how I am in relationships. It was basically, it felt like the iboga was showing me, here's what you do in relationships. See this pattern? See this? See this? You don't have to do that anymore. It was really remarkable because it was a very low dose.
And so, I've listened to some interviews and some podcasts, and I've heard you talk a little bit about your background and how that kind of led you into this kind of research and this study. Can you kind of talk about some of those early experiences you had that kind of have led you into this avenue?
You mean early psychedelic experiences?
Yes.
Yeah. So, so you may have run across something where I've been talking about how I got interested in psychedelics to begin with, but initially, so it was in my early 20s. I was a graduate student at Caltech in chemistry, and had my first experience with any psychedelic. It was at a Grateful Dead concert, and I had LSD, and it was one of the most profound experiences I've ever had. Just really opened my eyes up and showed me that I was already interested in studying consciousness, and at that point, it just blew the doors off. I just was, okay, this is really fascinating. I have to find out what's going on here. And about a month later, I had mushrooms for the first time, and that was at a remote location in Arizona, a really beautiful place. And that was also very eye-opening. I was with a girlfriend of mine at the time, and the most profound thing that came out of that, I really had profound experiences, but then the aftermath of that really changed my life. So not only did that tell me that psychedelics were really interesting and that I wanted to study these altered states of consciousness and what was going on, but I had been working in a neuroscience lab, working with rats and studying brain proteins that might be involved in memory and learning. Because I was interested in neuroscience. I was interested in brain biochemistry, and so I was working in this lab. But I never really wanted to do the animal research. I didn't like sacrificing the rats. I didn't like the fact that we're using these animals to find out things about the brain. After I had LSD and I had mushrooms, I had the strength to just say, look, I don't want to do this anymore. And I had what I thought was an insight, and I still think it's a valid insight, which is that the way we as humans use our environment, use animals for everything, but including food, including experimental research, how we use the forests, and how we do all the problems happening in the rainforest. This was back in the mid 80s, right? And so even then, that I was aware of these problems that were happening with in the environment, right? And it was clear to me that all that was necessary was for people to have a shift in consciousness and in their relationship to other beings and to the rest of the planet, and that could just be taken care of. And I thought, well, I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of the using animals for, it's important for us to understand memory and learning, right? But at the time, I realized that I didn't want to be killing other creatures just to have this knowledge, right? So whatever was going to come out of the experimentation, I thought, no, it's not going to be worth it. It's not going to be worth it for my soul. So I decided that I would stop doing that, and that's what gave me the courage to drop out of that grad program. And if it hadn't been for that,